Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome, a very warm welcome to St. Joseph's College. Tonight is a unique and very special night in the history of St. Joseph's College as we celebrate the inaugural lecture of the Khatib Chair in Comparative Religions. I can tell you how grateful we are to Georgianna Clifford Khatib and Dr. Reza Khatib, our dear friends, for the generous gift that is making all of this possible. I will be saying a few things more about them in a few moments. But right now, to set the tone for the evening, I would like to introduce Monsignor Edward Green, a very dear friend of the Khatibs and a very dear friend, especially of Georgie, Irene, his sister, who's here with us tonight. And Monsignor will ask God to bless all here present and to bestow on us the gifts of wisdom, understanding, and peace. After Monsignor's invocation, I will come back and say a few words which hopefully will embarrass the Khatibs at least a little bit.
Thank you, Sister. I can't start without saying, first of all, how happy I am to be here because the Khatibs, Georgianna and Reza, have been talking about this dream of theirs for a number of years, and it's wonderful to see it come to fruit. It's a wonderful thing. And I wasn't quite sure what to do in the way of an invocation, so I would simply share with you the prayerful thought that I used in the parish because it struck me that Lent this time of year is an appropriate time for us to have a lecture and a series like this. What struck me on Ash Wednesday was that I went to church. We had the Gospel from St. Matthew, which began with the instruction of Jesus for everybody: go to your room, close the door, be yourself, don't let your left hand know what your right hand is doing. And that seemed to be setting the tone. We finished the homily, we invited the people to come to the altar, and we blessed the ashes, and people came up to receive the ashes and went all over the city, letting people see the ashes on their head. People who sometimes don't even go to church on Sunday all wanted to be sure that they had ashes on Ash Wednesday. And I couldn't find myself thinking, that's almost like a contradiction. Stay in your room, don't let anybody know what's happening, and then get ashes and let the whole world know. And what I suggested to the people in the parish, and it struck me as an appropriate introduction for this series, not just for today, but for the rest of the series. The instruction I asked the people is this: I think that apparent contradiction, go to your room in private, think of your relationship with God, and then live it out in public. What is the gift that we're praying for? The gift of thinking about it. Think about your personal relationship with God, and think about how that should be lived in public. And it struck me this is a very, very appropriate occasion. It's an opportunity for people from the tradition of Islam and the tradition of Christianity to kind of take time to think about it. I couldn't help but pray, and my prayer tonight will be all of the men and women who will be the benefit of this particular lecture series in years to come. Will all be people who receive the grace of thinking about it. So Almighty God, the giver of life, we pray that this lecture tonight and all of the series will present us with the opportunity for the gift of God encouraging us to think about it. What we think about in the inner recesses of our hearts and what we do in our lives in public. We pray for this as we pray for all things, our Lord.
He's a little bit taller than I am. One of my favorite television programs is Nature, which is on PBS on Sunday evenings. And I love it because it is a celebration of the rich diversity with which our world has been blessed. And it features the incredible beauty of the millions and millions of species of flora and fauna that are so abundant in our world. And to pick up on Monsignor's theme, if we stop to think about it for a minute, that abundance and variety is astonishing, wonderful, and awesome. Just think, what would the world be like if there were only roses, lovely as they are, and no lilies, or azaleas, or peonies, or daisies? Daisy is the name of the Imam's wife, in case you didn't know. What would the world be like if there were just dogs and no cats? Now, I could live with that, but the opposite is unthinkable. What would the world be like if every place was flat and we had no mountains, or if every place was dry and we had no beaches? We love the variety of nature, from the tiniest hummingbird to the regal condor, from the minuscule minnow to the mighty whale. And we thank God for blessing us with so many species to explore, experience, and enjoy until we come to our own species. All of a sudden, we find the whole notion of diversity a bit off-putting. And we find ourselves inclined to find favor with those who look like us, who speak like us, who worship like us, who eat the kind of food we eat, and who generally are us. And yet, God's lavish generosity has extended to our kind as well as to all others. And there's great and wonderful diversity within the human race. Oddly and sadly, we often don't see it that way. But we view those who are different in whatever way as objects of fear or scorn or even hatred. And we hesitate to reach out to connect with them, to learn about them, and to relate to them. And that is why we at St. Joseph's College are so grateful to Georgianna Clifford Khatib, known as Georgie, and Dr. Reza Khatib, because they have a different approach, a different vision, and a deeper understanding of the way we are meant to live together on this small planet. Through their very generous gift, we have been able to establish our first endowed chair in comparative religions. The Khatib Chair will enable us to study and learn about many of the faith experiences of people throughout the world. And I hope and I believe that we will grow in a sense of respect and appreciation for them. It will provide our students with enriching, challenging, and transformative experiences that will in turn enable them to help transform our world. Georgia and Reza, this is a wonderful night in the history of St. Joseph's College. You have set us on a path to truth. You are challenging us to create here at St. Joseph's College a microcosm of the world we would all love to live in. A world in which the gifts of all are not just accepted, but truly appreciated. And a world in which differences are embraced as enriching the social fabric, not as threats to vested interests. Your gift will open the minds of our students for generations to come, inviting them to think independently and to engage themselves fully in this amazing adventure we all share, being human. Now, there is no material gift that could ever express adequately our gratitude, but we do have a little token, which we hope will make you proud of the wonderful thing you have done, and that will always remind you of your good friends here on Clinton Avenue and out in Patchogue. And here it is. Please come. They're wonderful friends, and we are really, truly, truly grateful. And now it is my great privilege to introduce our speaker for this evening, the Imam Faisal Abdul Rauf. When President Franklin D. Roosevelt proclaimed in his inaugural address that, quote, the only thing we have to fear is fear itself, he was attempting to instill courage and confidence in a people whose world had been badly battered by the trials of the Great Depression. In large measure, I think he was correct, but I think he only went part way. Because another thing we have to fear is ignorance. Indeed, ignorance is often at the root of fear, which in turn is at the heart of hatred, which in turn can lead to violence. We have had ample evidence of that in our time, and we are now engaged in a war, well, actually 2 wars, that are the fruit of a combination of ignorance and fear. It is imperative, therefore, that we Americans take the steps necessary to learn about those whom we know little, to dispel the myths, to enlighten ourselves, and to engage in honest, open, fruitful dialogue with those who might otherwise be objects of that fear and hatred. And through the great generosity of Dr. and Mrs. Khatib, we have an extraordinary opportunity to do just that. And during this semester, St. Joseph's College has been honored to have with us the Imam Faisal Abdul Rauf, a man who has spent his life serving as a bridge between Islam and the West, and he knows both intimately, as an insider does. And tonight the Imam has graciously agreed to speak with us about a topic on which he is uniquely qualified to speak: Islam in the 21st century. As the Imam of Masjid al-Farah in New York City, as the founder of the ASMA Society, which is a non-for-profit educational and cultural organization that seeks to reconcile differences between the American public and American Muslims, and as the co-founder of the Cordoba Initiative, which is a multi-faith effort geared toward the same goals, the Imam is playing a key role in the advancement of understanding across many religions. As the first holder of the Khatib Chair, he has been sharing his wisdom and experiences with our students during the semester, and all reports are that he's an excellent, albeit challenging, teacher, and to that I say, well done. To say that we are pleased and honored to have him with us would be a gross understatement. Since you came to listen to him, let me end this introduction by borrowing the words with which he ended his own book on the relationship between the Muslim world and America. He wrote, "I wish for humankind to drink deeply from that rich, nourishing current of spiritual traditions, those immutable principles of divine origin that have been given form in so many ways in human societies. Religion, which speaks to the eternal in us, must be the foundation of a robust, harmonious society and the animating principle of the whole life of a people. I am delighted and honored to introduce the Imam Faisal Abdul Rauf, who will help us to drink deeply from the rich spiritual traditions that can bind us together in that harmonious society to which he has dedicated his life."
Thank you so much, Sister Elizabeth, for that extremely eloquent introduction. I felt like I shouldn't say anything more after that. It is customary for Muslims to begin whatever they do by invoking the name of God, the one God that we all worship, the God of Muhammad, the God of Jesus Christ, the God of all of the prophets and messengers, the all-merciful, the all-compassionate Creator, and to call down His blessings upon us in this venture we are engaging and embarking upon this evening. I'd like to thank also Monsignor Breen for his wonderful introduction, his benediction, and his reminder to us for what we are going through right now, a time of Lent, a time when observing Christians would devote themselves to a particular act of worship of the Creator, the 40-day fast of Lent. We too as Muslims have our equivalent to it in the month of Ramadan, but for us this also coincides with the anniversary of the birthday of our Prophet. So this is a time in which we both celebrate occasions of religious importance to us. Sister Elizabeth talked about the variety of roses only or daisies only, or a world that would not have all this variety. And it reminded me of the verse in the Quran where God says, "O mankind, O humankind, O people, we created you from one male and one female, and we made you into a variety of tribes and nations. In other words, the diversity, the human diversity that God created is part of the divine plan. And that we did this, God adds, so that we would get to know each other and get to learn about each other. And the word of knowing means to engage with each other, that in that human discourse, in this human engagement, we learn about ourselves. I am not the first to have discovered the truth that when I've learned a second language, I know my own language better. For those of us who have studied a foreign language, we grow up with English or grow up with Arabic, but if you learn Spanish or Italian or French or Russian, then you discover much more about your own language. And the same is true about faith traditions. When I began to embark upon a study of other faith traditions, I began to understand my own better. And also learning about how others saw my own faith tradition, I learned through them a lot about my own faith tradition. And I think this engagement that we have is wonderful, and I'm very proud and thankful to Dr. Reza and Georgianna Khatib for their having made me part of the dream. I thank you very much, and I'd like to honor you and express the gratitude not only of myself, but all who are present here. And we ask for God's grace and God's blessings upon you both. May He grant you a long life, happy life, many more enjoyment of what life provides, and may we benefit by your wisdom and by your generosity to us. Thank you both very much indeed. I did have in mind that we should be engaging with each other, so I'm going to give a very brief presentation and reserve the bulk of my remarks to insert it into the comments and questions, to the answers to the questions that I know many of you have. But I'd like to begin by saying what is the important thing that I think faces us, faces the Muslim world, and faces America in the 21st century regarding Islam. As Sister Elizabeth made in her final remark, the issue of the day that faces us as people who are of religious belief, who believe in our religions, who believe that there is a God, who believe that God has made demands upon us, that God expects us to live our lives in accordance with His commandments. And we believe that the ethical principles and these divine commandments are relevant to how we conduct ourselves, not only in our personal lives, but also in our professional lives and in our public lives. And there's where the rub comes in. Where's the role and what's the role of religion in the public square? Where do you draw the line, the dividing line, between what is God's and what is Caesar's, to use the language of the Bible? Western society, in general, has struggled with this issue, and so have Muslim societies. The Muslim world has defined this, the non-Muslim world, the Western world, has developed a concept of separation of church and state. So you give to God what is God's on Sunday or Saturday, the Sabbath day, and don't get politics involved with religion. So we have a separation of church and state, as we understand it in America. And yet the American founding documents, the American Declaration of Independence, is based upon the concept of providing religious freedoms to its people. And while we have a separation of church and state in America, there's no separation of church and state in England. The Queen is the head of the Church of England. Jack Straw, who used to be the Foreign Secretary, equivalent to the Secretary of State in America, once said a couple of years ago in Davos, I don't know why Americans are very stuck on the separation of church and state. I appoint bishops, he said. Now, this to an American sounds very odd, but as a friend of mine stated in a very eloquent lecture, in England, you do not have a separation of church and state, but you have a separation of religion and politics. In India, on the other hand, you have separation of church and state, but you have no separation of religion and politics. And America, he said, is somewhere in the middle. We are somewhere in the middle. Now, Muslim societies are still struggling with this piece of unfinished business. And I think this issue of defining the role of religion in the public square, defining its limits, what I call the relationships between institutions of political power and governance and authority, and institutions of religious authority and power, is the unfinished business of the Muslim world today. And that is one of the fundamental issues which needs to be addressed, because that lies at the source of much of the discourse that we see taking place. It lies it is the fundamental cause of the deployment of religious vocabulary in the Muslim world for political ends. It lies at the core of the deployment of religious arguments for what we call extremist religious ideologies today. And therefore, addressing this one particular issue is the issue of concern. And that is why one of the projects that we have done under the Cordoba, we're working on under the initiative, the Cordoba Initiative, which I founded in 2002 after 9/11, to bridge this issue to bridge rather the relationship between the West, the United States in particular, and the Muslim world. One of its projects, we have several, is this issue of how to change the discourse on this very issue. How to redefine in the mindset and the opinion of many Muslims, both leaders as well as the common folk, how to think differently about this issue. So basically what we have done is we've gotten a group of scholars from various parts of the Muslim world, asked them what defines an Islamic state, and it's pretty much the same as you would have if you brought a group of, let's say, Christian scholars and asked them what's a Christian state. No matter how they defined it, it would have to boil down to love of God and love of neighbor, since these are the two fundamental primary commands, which Jesus said. I mean, no Christian scholar is going to say that a Christian state is a state where God isn't loved or neighbor isn't loved, because it violates the fundamental commandments. You may say, well, you have to have churches on, certain number of churches per population, or whether ashes are provided to the people on Ash Wednesday, or they have to burn it themselves. There may be some various opinions on issues like that, but the core ethical principles are there. So then, if you rate countries on how well people feel they are given the opportunity to love God and love neighbor, then you have a definition and rating of how Christian a state is. That's kind of what we are doing with Islamic law in this project. And we're working with the Gallup organization to utilize their polling techniques and expertise to create a rating, an annual rating of different countries on how compliant they are. And guess what? Western countries score very highly on many of these issues. In fact, on some of these things, some of the Western countries score even higher than demographically Muslim countries. So this is a brief introduction about on one of the important issues facing Islam in the 21st century, and a methodology and of how to create the kind of change we would like to see. As Obama said, change that we can believe in. Change that both sides believe in as emanating from their core values, and showing both sides how common values underlie what we view to be fundamentally opposing things. So with that introduction, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to now then open the floor to your engagement, your questions, and your engagement with me. And we have some microphones here in preparation for the many questions, and feel free to ask any question you want.
Without a central authority in Islam.
I'm sorry?
Without a central authority
Yes.
in Islam. How do you propose to get your various groups together and come to a conclusion that all would feel obliged to accept?
Excellent question. As the gentleman pointed out, we do not have a pope in our faith tradition, which is both a plus and a minus. As somebody said, we Catholics at least have somebody to be angry with, we get angry with, you have somebody who we can rail against. You don't have anybody to be angry against, which is kind of true. That's part of the challenge. However, there is a tradition among Muslims, because Islam is also a religion of law. It shares with Judaism certain aspects, and with Christianity certain aspects. And what Islam shares with Judaism is that law is important. And so what we have done is gotten a group of Muslim legal scholars, a working group, and asked them to create those principles, which we have already worked out. And once we have the product, our plan therefore is to approach the most respected scholars. So the most respected scholars, let's say, in Saudi Arabia, in Egypt, in Iran, because these three countries, and Pakistan, as one of our scholars said, these four countries, have a posture that they own the faith of Islam, in some respect or another. So if you get the top scholars in these countries, who are highly regarded, and get their buy-in, and then get another level of buy-in, that's the process by which we hope to attain a critical mass. And we don't have to get everybody on board, because this is again like submitting a case to the Supreme Court. We very rarely have a 9-0 decision. In fact, the vast majority of decisions are 5-4. But if you can get, and very often, the largest position, or the largest number, because not even the majority. I mean, if you have, let's say, 3 different opinions, you could have 40% believing one thing, 30% believing another, 20% a third, and the balance not having an opinion. So you don't even have to have a majority necessarily. But if you have a critical mass, an articulate critical mass, at least you can begin to change the nature of the discourse on the subject. And if you're able to change the discourse, which is what we call in America the power of the bully pulpit, which is one of the powers of our presidency, the ability to determine the agenda of what people talk about. So when Clinton came to power, he made healthcare the issue. So everybody talked about healthcare. You go to a cocktail party, a dinner party, everybody talks about healthcare. If Reagan talks about empowering America, that becomes the subject of the day. So if you create a discourse about it and amplify it and do it well, it will certainly have an impact upon the nature of the discourse on the subject matter, and that is how we believe we'll be able to have an impact upon how people think about this subject in the Muslim world. Because generally, if you ask people what is a Muslim country, they will either define it demographically, which is one way it is used today, and those who try to define it in terms of Islamic law, believe the only thing they've been able to get a handle on is to use the penal code. Right? That's like saying, if you want to have an American state, punish people the way Americans punish people, and you have a US-style democracy or US-style governance, which is totally incoherent and illogical. But that seems to have been the way by which some countries, especially Sudan and Afghanistan and the Taliban especially, had defined their definition of Islamicity, which is really not the right way to go about it. Yes.
Why is it that Europe?
You can.
Why is it that Europe is having such a hard time being they're more secular, they're more socially liberal? Why is it that they're having such a hard time acclimating and welcoming Islamic immigrants into their social fabric?
In Europe?
Yes.
Thank you for that question. The question is why do Europeans seem to have a problem or some kind of ambivalence about integrating Muslims into their societal fabric? I believe this has to do with a couple of things. The narrative of how immigrants came to Europe. Immigrants were imported to Europe because they needed labor. And Europe has been going through a fundamental shift in its self-perception of itself as a society. America is a multicultural society. We're all hyphenated Americans. We're all German Americans, Irish Americans, Italian Americans, German Americans, Latin Americans, African Americans, Jewish Americans, Catholic, and we accept this as part of our societal fabric. We celebrate our diversity. We're not all roses and daisies in America. But many societies, which are traditionally what I call monocultural, that's what Europe is very much like. Traditionally, Europe has been a number of countries, each which has a very set definition of what it is, what it means to be French, what it means to be German, what it means to be English. You have to be white. You have to be Anglican if you're going to be real English. If you're an English Catholic, you're not quite English. You don't belong to the Anglican Church, the Church of England, and that's what it's called. That's part of the historical tensions that existed between Catholics and Protestants in the British Isles, for instance. And yet, I also see Europe, in spite of itself, evolving towards a multicultural society. The fact that they've created the European Union, the fact that they've tried to create a kind of a United States of Europe, where they're now going to have French and Germans and Irish and all these varieties of peoples that just a generation ago were killing each other. And who would have thunk it, as Americans say? Just as recently as 40, 50 years ago, that not only could you travel peacefully without even showing your passport from Spain all the way to Norway or Sweden, but that these countries are not even fighting each other, but they're even actually forming a union. This is completely novel. So we see right now the what I call the growing pains and evolving pains of a Europe that is shifting its self-identity, and those who are holding on to an image of what it means to be European, that we are all secularists, or that we don't believe in religion, or that we're anti-religion, or that we're all of one faith tradition. These are the issues that I see happening in Europe today. But I think that the example of America, Canada, Australia, and the way the world has traditionally been multicultural. That is the way most of our societies were. I grew up in an Egypt that was very multicultural. We had Italians, we had Greeks who lived there for generations. We had Copts, we had different religions. We had Egyptian Jews, we had Egyptian Christians, the Copts. We had varieties of churches under the Ottomans, in Iraq, in Iran, Morocco, all over you go. We were multicultural for centuries and centuries. But somehow, the history of the nation state and the rise of the nation state as a homogeneous grouping was something that Europe was taught the Muslim world, I think, to our detriment. But the rise of multicultural societies, again, is the way the world is going. I think the world is gradually, in fits and starts, shifting and finding its way towards that kind of a vision, especially in a much more globalized world today. But that to me is the reason why we see those tensions in Europe. But my sense is within a generation or two, and with the leadership provided by the United States, we will see that shift happening in Europe as well. In fact, one of our projects, because this speaks also to the evolution of religious communities. If you look at the history of the Catholic community in America, the Jewish community in America, when they first immigrated, they had problems as well. Catholic churches were burnt. Catholics were regarded as something that people were afraid of in America. In fact, the whole language of separation of church and state did not exist in this country until the 20th century. And some even suggest that the very language separation of church and state was intended to be the separation of the Catholic Church. It was meant to, as a pushback against what was considered, they used to call it, in the early part of the 1900s, the Catholic steamroller. Because Catholics were growing, they were getting stronger, they became part of the American societal fabric. And the Catholic Church, until Vatican II, did not believe in separation of church and state. But it was the writings of the American Catholic bishops, particularly John Courtney Murray, but also many of the American Catholic bishops themselves took positions and stands to say that they were not against America. They were not trying to control the government of America. And the role of the American Catholics, the American bishops, was important in actually influencing the Vatican on this particular issue. But the other part of the narrative, the history, is that over a period of, let's say, a century, an American Catholic identity emerged. The same thing with the American Jewish immigrants. The American Jewish identity emerged with its institutions and its local churches and its local theology, etc. Related to the old country, but grafted into this society, grafted into the American concepts of freedom and respect of religious traditions. And we see the same thing happening right now with the American Muslim immigrant community. We are going through the same history, the same evolutionary trends that the Catholics went through, that other religious communities went through. And with the rise and strengthening, empowerment of this community will also be the effective bridge between the United States and the countries that they belong to, because, as Sister Elizabeth said, they are internal to both what it means to be American, what it means to be Western, and what it means to be Muslim. And these are the instruments that have bridged traditionally and will bridge the relationship between the United States and the Muslim world. Thank you.
I go to another part of the world, which is India and Islam, right? And what I have seen living in that country, there are two parts of Islam. One is Shia, the other one is Sunni. And the Iranians have an older culture than the Saudis. They celebrate their New Year, their Persian New Year. They delight in their language, and they are proud of their language. They think themselves, I think, to be Iranians first, Persians first, rather than Muslims. And also when you spoke about India, India is not religion and politics. India is language and politics. India has several different communities, and each one speaks its own language. Also, it only has a Muslim influence in the north, where the Mughals lead, and the Mughals, the Shias, they were not Sunnis. And in the south, we do not have an influence at all. So in the south, you have Jews who ran away from Syria. You have Syrian Christians who ran away from Syria, who call the Syria one of our Christians. And you have the Zoroastrians who ran away from Persia, living as Zoroastrians did. I think India has been a very tolerant country. It allows you to do what you like in your area, but it doesn't let you influence other people. And I think Indians are more, because they tried to make Hindi the national language, as you know, 30 years ago, and everyone said, English ever, Hindi never, never, because each one thought that his native language was more important than a universal language. You know, if it was like a Mughal Sanskrit mix, the Hindi language, they didn't like it because the Mughals were not Indians. I mean, centuries. We go by centuries, like the Iranians. So would you like to comment how you think what the Iranians have ayatollahs, like we have our Pope, the Iranians have ayatollahs, and believe you me, they are learned men. I have spoken to them in Karachi. And they do listen to each other and they are in groups. But as far as the Sunnis are, they may have some colleges, but there are many people who come Maulanas without any qualification whatsoever. And people allow them to be that way. And the Wahhabis, like, what would you call the Wahhabis as compared to Iran? Because Iranians, they don't let you mess around in their country. But they don't come around to your country to tell you what to do, because they're an old country. So would you like to comment on this?
Certainly. Thank you. Thank you very much. Well, you certainly are right that pluralism was something that existed in all parts of the world. My point was that with the rise of the nation-state phenomenon in Europe in the 16th, 17th century, after the end of the attempts to build a Holy Roman Empire or a Christendom broke, and then the rise of nation-states, this fomented the initiatives or attempts to create nation-states modeled on a homogeneous society. And this led to many things: the creation of Israel as a Jewish state, the creation of Pakistan as an Islamic state, the notion that in one religion, that in one geography, you have to have only one religion or one language or one ethnicity. This notion is a modern notion in human notion. But if you look at traditional societies, look at India, if you look at whether under the Mughals or under others, if you look at Baghdad during the time of the Abbasids, if you looked at most of under Ottoman rule until the 20th century, most of these societies were very pluralistic. The Ottomans ruled over Turks, over Arabs, over Armenians, over varieties of various peoples. So it's certainly valid on that point. It is true when Islam spread from Arabia, it spread to countries that were not Arab. Even what is today called the Arab world were not really Arab. The Egyptians, the country where I come from, they spoke a different language. The Moroccans spoke Berber. The Iraqis were Mesopotamian. But as they got Arabized the same way that Latin America got, influenced by Spanish culture and Spanish language. But then even outside those countries which were Arabized, countries like Senegal, West Africa, Nigeria, much of sub-Saharan Africa where you have Islam, in Iran, in Turkey, in South Asia, the Indian subcontinent, all the way to Indonesia, you see peoples who are non-Arab speaking, and yet who are Muslim and who are devout Muslims, as they are of any other religious tradition. The Shia Islam has to do with, again, a political history in the origin of Islam. It began after the death of the Prophet. He was one of the few successful prophets in his own lifetime. David and Solomon were some others who, during their own prophethood, became political leaders as well. So the issue of political succession was the source of the difference between Shia and Sunni, which led to some differences in terms of authority. And so you are correct. In the Shia mindset, there's a greater amount of respect given to the Ayatollah, who is considered to be more than just a scholar. Almost like a blend between a scholar and a holy man or a saintly person. Whereas we have had such individuals in the Sunni tradition, their hold on the political role was not as high. And within the Shia community, it is only, I would say, in the last, maybe since the Iranian Revolution, that the rise or the combination of a religious ideology with political power got combined in the Shia world. Of course, in Saudi Arabia, that was the marriage, if you will, between the House of Saud and the House of Abdul Wahhab. So this notion of a marriage between the religious authority, the political authority, and therefore what is religiously correct became politically correct, and what is religiously incorrect became politically incorrect. And this combination of religion and political power is something which as I said earlier, is the unfinished business of the Muslim world. It's something which is very sensitive to Muslims, but it's something which many Muslims feel ambivalent about. But there is no doubt that I've known many Iranians and many Ayatollahs, and Dr. Reza's father was a great, maybe Ayatollah and Khatib. The word Khatib means a person who gives sermons. That's why his name is Khatib. It's like, the traditional names when we have Mr. Shoemaker and Mr. Blacksmith were people who worked in those trades. So Khatib was a sermon giver, and that is the family name of our benefactor. You will find a lot more openness to new religious interpretations among the Shia, because in the Shia understanding of jurisprudence and law, it is the live Ayatollah who renders the opinion and the legal decision. Whereas in the Sunni tradition, because we did not have this central authority, then the decisions themselves tended to become a bit hardened. But these are some of the issues which you put your finger on, which we are battling with the Muslim today, and which we need to address. This is part of the challenges of Islam in the 21st century, including its relationship with other faith traditions. In the Indian subcontinent, of course, between Islam and Hinduism. And that is something which I feel has undergone a very negative chapter in the last century. It was only 50 years ago that an Indian Muslim was called a Hindu Muslim. The word Hindu was used in India to describe an Indian. It did not exclusively mean of the Hindu faith tradition. A Hindu Muslim, that word was used 50, 60 years ago to refer to an Indian Muslim. Look at how language has divided us, and how we've redefined the use of language to refer to ideologies and political ideologies which have turned out to be divisive. Thank you. Let's.
Yeah, a lot of Christians in the south.
Oh yes.
I thought we are 49% are Catholic, and even in Iran, you have at least 45%, either Syrian Orthodox or Orthodox Catholic. So in India, as I told you, it's many nations.
Yes.
The south of India doesn't have too much bias.
I know. My wife is from India, so I'm very familiar with India. And I love the Kerala hot oil massage. If you've never seen it, I recommend it to everybody over here. The moment that hot oil hits your third eye, you have a spiritual experience. Thank you. Yes.
Good evening. I'm very curious to hear how you're involving women in the discussion of the future of Islam in the 21st century with the dialogue that you're having with religious leaders. Are there women, Islamic religious leaders who are involved, and how do you see their role in moving things forward?
Yes, we do. In fact, one of our projects is a project which we have called WISE, W-I-S-E, which is the Women's Initiative in Spirituality and Ethics. And my wife right there is the one who runs it. Would you like to say something about it, Daisy? Why not? people always attack Muslims as not being respectful to their women and, oppressing their women. Look at Dr. Reza, look at me, and here we are. Look at Debbie Muntasir, who is over here. We are very active women. But we do have a women's project, and we have brought a number of women. We're having our next women's meeting actually in July in Kuala Lumpur, to which you're welcome to come, make a documentary about it. In fact, one of the highlights to me was when Daisy came, I think about a year ago. She had a meeting with Gloria Steinem, Helen Hunt, and all of these ladies who were so excited about this particular project and how they're dealing with all these women, many of whom are very powerful, influential women who have gone through their experience. And what was very exciting to many of the Muslim women who attended our first conference a year and a half ago, was when they heard women like Helen Hunt speaking about her experience growing up in the church in the South in Texas, and how she was relegated to the basement of the church and women were only allowed to bake cookies and not be part of the power structure. That they discovered that what people thought to be Muslim issues were actually universal gender issues. That these gender issues existed within the Catholic Church, it exists within the Christian community, it exists within the Jewish community. We had a woman rabbi come to it, and it was fascinating. And both the non-Muslim women participants and the Muslim participants who were women were very excited and thrilled by this sisterhood. And the estrogen in the room was amazing. And it was, for me, very, very informative. And of course, many of us who were part of the organization and part of our supporters were very keen to see this and to see this become something important. And we are working with women who are from other countries as well, Saudi Arabia, Afghanistan. The lady from Afghanistan actually had run against Hamid Karzai and claimed in the presentation that had the election not been rigged, she would have been the president of Afghanistan. But she was eloquent, she was powerful, she was compelling, she was articulate. And I remember when I was watching that, attending the conference, how I thought to myself, because as a growing boy, I remember looking at adults speaking and recognizing that as much as I loved my father and respected my father and tried to emulate my father in many ways, there were other men who had skills that my father didn't have. Okay, so my father was didn't care about his clothing very much, but I had an eye for good tailoring. So I said, I want to dress like this man. I want to be as articulate as this man. And I said to myself, if I had grown up watching these women, we had people like Nafis Sadiq, who was head of the UN refugees. We had Baroness Odin, who was a Muslim woman who was a member of the House of Lords in England. Articulate, brilliant, bright. I would have emulated. I would have actually considered these women to be my role models. So to see women whom I could regard as role models was to me a very powerful experience and a wonderful experience. And I think this is what our Prophet intended. And part of the unfinished business of the Muslim world is the providing of whether you call it equity or equality, gender equality and gender equity, whatever the right expression is something that certainly we're working on. And I think it is happening. It is happening. And it is happening as a result of the political trends and because of the economic trends. If you look at what led to the rise of women in the United States, it was that the sisters and daughters and wives of rich men who made it were the ones who funded a lot of the colleges, for example, for education, and so forth. And we see the same trends happening over the last, say, 30, 40 years in the Muslim world. And the Gulf countries, as women became rich, there was a women's bank 30 years ago that was started to cater to women. But now you have women ministers in the Gulf countries. So we see a lot of movement a Ministry of Women in Malaysia that we are exploring the idea of doing this event with. So certainly women is very much central to our list of projects. Did you want to add something, Daisy? I think Daisy's body language says, let me say what you couldn't say.
No, I just wanted to say one thing, and that is that I think everything you said is true. But I learned one thing from my Christian and Jewish sisters here in the United States, especially faith-based women, whose activism is mostly fueled by their faith. And they said, unless you start your own institutions, you can't really create a change. So one of the things that we've decided to do, and if you look at the world, the map of the Muslim world, 500 million Muslims are Muslim women. It's a staggering number. And there isn't a single institution, a global institution, that is a women's institution that speaks on behalf of women. So oftentimes when a women's issue rises, you hear from Amnesty International, you hear from Human Rights Watch, or you hear from the press. So we would like to be in a position to speak for ourselves, to define ourselves, to redefine our faith, because we know we've been given the rights. And so for this reason, we've created a religious council, which is called the Shura Council, a Muslim women's consultative body, which will look at Muslim women's religious issues. And it will also go as far as, do we have the permission to issue fatwas? That is the day, I think that is where we like to go. In fact, this July, we thought that we would touch upon a woman's issue. And then we said, why? We women are the glue that hold the families together. We are the glue that hold the communities together. And ultimately, we are the glue that holds the society together. So why should we only focus on a woman's issue? Let's focus on a global issue. So our fatwa is going to be issued on violence. Violence in general.
You had a question?
My question is similar to the last question, and I guess I was going to say that I was very impressed that you followed the Declaration of Independence as part of your views. You share similar ideals, and my question was, how long do you think before you have this word written or a system listed in this wonderful institution?
Oh, we've had them already. Oh yes, we have had 5 women heads of state. All right, Turkey, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Indonesia. Well, India, yes, but India is not a Muslim country, but we've had Muslim women heads of state in 4 countries thus far. We have women ministers in many countries. We have women heads of colleges. More so in some societies than in others. Let's say Indonesia and Malaysia, which were, or even in Egypt, because Egypt has a history of queens. So, I grew up with seeing powerful Egyptian women and women, heading senior positions in radio stations and so forth.
Less so in the Gulf. I noticed that the traditional nomadic societies tended to be more patriarchal, whereas the agricultural societies tended to be more matriarchal. And so these cultural norms have seeped through. You find, let's say, Black African societies, women tend to be very strong and very powerful. So you'll find in countries like Senegal and Nigeria, women are quite influential and very strong. Very strong. Even if you see, even in an African American society, women are very strong. And I remember I was surprised once when I came to this country at the age of 17, and there was this lady who was a big, strong African American woman, Muslim. She invited what to me then was some of the leaders of the African American Muslim community. And she spoke to them like they were kids and talking down at them, and they were just listening like little pussycats. And I said, boy, I could never imagine such a scene happening in, let's say, in some Arab countries. So these are very much cultural things. So you will see it It is beginning to happen now in the Gulf countries. King Abdullah of Saudi Arabia just appointed a deputy woman minister, which was considered groundbreaking in Saudi Arabia. But in the non-Arab countries, or in the Arab countries which are African, you will see more. Egypt, for example, has had women for a long time in senior positions. Thank you. Yes, sir.
Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam.
Recently, I heard a professor of Islamic studies speak about the evolving stereotypes of and toward Muslims. And she spoke about the evolving stereotype of the camel jockey and the oil sheik and the terrorist. And now the stereotype of Muslims is evil. She spoke about once someone is labeled and given the stereotype evil, evil is to be wiped out. And recently, we've had, post 9/11, the religious profiling of Muslims because of this stereotype of Muslims being evil. I was wondering if you could address your own experience and what you've heard within the Muslim community of the religious profile and ethnic profile that's been in our country and the world now, post 9/11. And I'd also like to hear if you could speak about a very strong stereotype and belief that the Quran teaches the violence and the terrorism we have in our world today. If you could possibly speak on those two.
Certainly.
The profiling and the stereotype of the Quran being a book of violence.
Thank you. Stereotypes are things that are created in a society and sustained, especially by the instruments, mainly the media, both the news media and entertainment media. When I grew up in the 50s, I remember watching westerns in which the cowboys and the Indians were always the bad guys. So you grew up with the stereotype that the Indians are a warring people. They just hate, white people. They're bad, they're evil, they're uncivilized, etc. The same thing with the Tarzan movies. When I was growing up, there was these Tarzan movies, and the blacks were always regarded as savages. And then by the 60s and 70s, these types of films and stereotypes are considered no longer acceptable. But the image in the movies, in the media, of the Muslim as being the terrorist, as being the oil sheikh, prevailed until 9/11. Even in the news media, the word Muslim was often used as an adjective for terrorist. We use Muslim terrorist, but the Christian freedom fighters, okay, or the Christian phalangists in Lebanon. All right, so there was already a stereotype being given in the very language that was being used. Now, of course, until 9/11, we would complain about it, but not get very far. But 9/11 signified a major shift because we began speaking about this thing. We began speaking up about the role of the media in both shaping and sustaining prejudices and stereotypes. And these stereotypes are what give us the notion of the other. Okay, we need to demonize them so we can attack them. Because when you know somebody, you don't feel the same way to them about them. Right? I mean, many of the people, when many Americans says, you know what, my doctor is a Muslim, my dentist is a Muslim, the guy who delivers the food to my house from the grocery store is a Muslim. He's a nice guy, he's an honest guy. So, or you fall in love with a Muslim, you befriend a Muslim. When you have personal relationships with people, you begin to see people as human. And the stereotypes dehumanizes people. But we were talking about that, especially after 9/11, and we are grateful to see that at least the movie industry has stopped doing that. You see much less now. There may still be instances of it, but you see much less the idea of regarding Muslims as de facto being terrorists. And the use of language is critical, both in the Western world and in the Muslim world. That is why one of our projects, again, another project, because we believe that the four sources of conflict between the West and the Muslim world has to do with, number one, political conflicts, of which Israel-Palestine is number one, and now Iraq and Afghanistan and the relationship with Iran are probably among the issues. That's number one. Number two is what you have put your finger on, which is the role of media in creating and sustaining negative stereotypes that each has of the other, and using language which just smears everybody. So if you're a Muslim, you're viewed to be a terrorist. And the flip side has happened in the Muslim world. So people say, why is America invading us? Why did America invade Iraq? And I said, it wasn't America that invaded, it was Bush who invaded Iraq. I mean, the Iraq war was deeply divisive. There were hundreds of thousands of people who demonstrated on the streets of New York City before the Iraq war. But people tend to forget that, and we use language which demonizes everybody. And that's the language which bin Laden has used. And bin Laden argued in one of his clips, saying that he accused Clinton during the Monica Lewinsky era as bombing Iraq to distract attention from his, his what? His lack of behavior, okay. Or his problem, his challenge. And listen to his argument. His argument is that the United States of America gets its funding not from assets that America has, but from taxes of the American people. And 2/3 of the American people supported Clinton in the bombing of Iraq. And because of that, we are okay to go after Americans. Okay? You have to demonize the other in order to be able to get people to kill and attack other people. So this is the challenge that's happening on both sides. We need to change this stereotyping and change the language that is being used. So media is important because media is critical in shaping that. Then, as you pointed out, the role of religious interpretation. Okay? There are verses in the Bible that speak about killing people or doing people treated. And yes, there are verses like this in the Quran. But these verses were understood by classical jurists to refer to historical incidents. It's like reading the newspaper from the 1860s and saying the Republicans are, for freeing the black man. Well, at that time the Democrats were against freeing of the slaves. And regarding that as being permanent in history. Well, there are verses. When I debate with my my fellow Muslims, I say there are verses in the Quran which says the people of Medina are hypocrites. Does it mean it's applicable today, to the people of today? So when you have a historical document, the role of religious interpretation is very important. But even with religious interpretation, the politics is actually what is driving it. Okay? In our assessment, and the assessment of many experts, the political conflicts is what seeds the problem. It's like the problems that existed in Ireland between Catholics and Catholics and Protestants had almost nothing to do with issues of religious interpretation between the Catholic faith tradition and the Protestant faith tradition. What happens is that people usually fight over issues of political parity or power and economic power. Now, if you have a disparity between a group and another, regardless of what you call them, Hutus and Tutsis, if you have a sociological grouping and you give power and economic well-being to the Protestants and not to the Catholics, which is what the perception of the Irish Catholics were, then you have a conflict between these two groups. But after the conflict gets started, people forget the political and economic source of the conflict, and they say, well, if you are a Catholic, then I hate you if I'm a Protestant, and vice versa. But the problem does not really originally lie in that. It's not driven by that. yes, you can find verses here, comments by people. But if you solve the political problem, I assure you that these issues of religious interpretation will attenuate. Yet, even having said that, this is why we are addressing it directly in terms of defining Islamicity of the state. So that's the third source of conflict. And the fourth source of conflict is the comment that you pointed out earlier, is the one which our Catholic predecessors in this country went through. Okay? Where you have immigrant communities becoming part of a new society, which is what's happening in the West, and there are frictions between the growing community and the larger and broader community, until that community becomes assimilated into that society and accepted and considered one of its own. I hope I've touched upon both of your questions.
I think there is a more positive interpretation of the Quran regarding violence that people tend to stereotype regarding the Quran.
Yes. In other words, what I'm saying is that the incidence of verses on violence are really issues of historical incidents which have happened. And the whole 14 centuries of history, of Islamic history, proves that Islam was not about forcing people under their rule to become Muslims. Because if this were the case, most of India would be Muslims. Because about 70% of India was ruled at one time at the height by the Mughals. The Muslims ruled over major non-Muslim populations. The Turks did, the Arabs did. There would be no non-Muslims at all in Iraq, in Egypt, and yet there are Christian communities, Jewish communities, from Morocco to wherever you are in the Muslim world. So the history of Islam itself provides the best proof that Islam protected and gave other communities the rights of freedom of practice. This is our tradition. So we need to make that interpretation more dominant today, and that is the battle that is being waged within the Muslim world.
The example I heard was that the Quran says the only time the Muslims should use violence against their enemy is when their families are attacked because of religious persecution.
Or yes, or when they're attacked, period. This is the argument that many Muslims have today. Because the Muslims who argue for that say, look, it's our lands that have been attacked. We've been attacked in Palestine, we've been attacked in Iraq, we've been attacked, we don't have our armies in the United States or in Europe. All right, we go there to work and make a living. But it's those armies that are in our lands, and this is where the rub is. Okay, can we please allow other people to ask? I'll be happy to ask. This gentleman is waiting. I'll be happy to answer that question. Yes, sir.
Some secular Jews maintain that they can be Jewish by ethnicity and not by faith. Is Islam a culture?
That's a very good question. Islam is less a culture than it is a faith, than a religious tradition. People speak about Islamic civilization, Islamic art, Islamic, dress, Islamic state, etc. But that is, to me, kind of the use of talking about what Muslims do as such. It's like talking about Christian music. Well, yeah, you can talk about Gregorian chants and church music as Christian music, but the music that is sung in the United States and other parts of the Christian world would be really come out of their cultural tradition. So one can speak about a culture in some respects, but a Muslim is a Muslim because of his or her belief, his or her creed. And to be a Muslim, you have to, the word Muslim, according to the Quran, is not something that is used to describe exclusively the follower of the Prophet Muhammad. It is used to mean anybody who surrenders to God. Anybody who believes in God, because the word Islam is to surrender, and the person surrenders to the Creator in whatever name, that person is a Muslim. It is used to define a human soul that surrenders to the Creator and tries to live a life accordingly. So you believe in God. The Muslim has to believe in God, believe in the angels, believe in the prophets, believe in the scriptures, and believe in what we call the last day, which is the day of resurrection and day of judgment, followed by paradise and hell. George Bush believes in these things. Okay? And most Christians believe in those things. That's the definition of a believer. And what does a Muslim have to do? You have to say, I believe in God, that there's no God but the one God. In our case, we also accept that Muhammad is his messenger. He or she has to pray. We both pray. Give charity, fast, and in some traditions, not all, do the pilgrimage. But who doesn't do that? Any religious tradition, has a notion of the Creator, the notion of an absolute, the absolute truth, the absolute reality, absolute being, absolute consciousness, which is how we define God. And engage and understand that as human beings who are created in the image of the Creator, there's a God presence or a God particle in us. The narrative in the Quran says that when God formed the form of Adam of clay, He breathed into him of His own spirit. That's the very wording in the Quran. So as Muslims, we believe that the human soul contains something of the divine. So as a creature that has something of the divine in it, we know intuitively, and if not, we will have had some experience in our lives. I did a poll of my students. How many of you have had an experience of God? That in some of your mind you think it was a Prince of God. 2/3 of them have had such an experience. We know intuitively that there is a Creator there that we have to relate to. So a Muslim, according to the Quran, is a person who engages with God that way. So by that definition, all the prophets are Muslim, and everyone who believes in that is a Muslim. It's like the word Catholic with a small c, meaning universal. But we have taken it and unfortunately taken these terms and created a sense of a community. We have defined it as a nation-state concept almost. And that's where I think Muslims have gone wrong. But if we define Islam in terms of its what I call the physics, the dynamics of what it means to be a believer, then we will say, yes, you are Muslims like we are Muslims. You practice according to the method of Jesus Christ. We practice according to the method of Muhammad. And I'm no less a Christian because I believe in Jesus Christ. I believe in the Holy Spirit. I have a personal dream of Jesus Christ myself. And we've been given instructions by Him. So if to be a Christian means to follow the way of the Messiah, of the Anointed One, and we think in terms of its substantive dynamics, then we can comfortably say, according to that definition, we are both Muslim and both Christian. Thank you, sir. Yes, ma'am.
I was raised in a very faithful Protestant family, and the church in which I was raised was very socially conscious. There was a lot of interdenominational as well as interfaith emphasis. My children belong to the same religion, the same denomination, and yet I feel that the church of today is different than the church in which I was raised. And I have a real suspicion that a lot of that has to do with September 11th. So I wanted to ask you, do you feel that there's been a shift also in the Muslim faith? Do you think that September 11th continues to reverberate? And what can we do about that? I know that that's a very global question, but I think it's so important that we believe, that we understand that we have to, the only way to truly have a faith is to understand the faith of others.
Indeed.
But I don't believe that people feel that way anymore.
There's no doubt that after 9/11, it created a tidal wave of fear about Muslims. And yet what is wonderful about this country is that by and large, the American public did not single out Muslims and make them targets of anger and hate crimes. In other countries, you have had lots of people being attacked. Yes, there were a couple of incidents. A couple of them were even mistaken identity as Sikhs who were mistaken for being Muslims. But by and large, the experience that I have experienced after 9/11 was an incredible amount of support. I went back to, my mosque is just like a dozen blocks from ground zero. I could not go to the mosque for 3 weeks because they cordoned off everything below 14th Street for about 3 weeks, or Canal Street rather, for 3 weeks. And I was surprised by the flowers, the messages, the notes, can we do anything to help you? So we found that by and large, most of the Americans have been very, very wonderful, very friendly about it. While that has happened, yes, there's also been an element of fear. And this is why we have been invited by many churches and synagogues to speak about Islam. And that's why I started the Khatib Initiative, because in a church in Greenwich, a lady got up and said, what can a good Christian lady like me do to help? The same question you're asking. 90 days after 9/11, I was invited by the Board of Governors of the American Jewish Community to speak to them. And I says, what can we do to help? We feel that the status quo between our faith communities is just not where it should be. So there's a lot of goodwill there. And that's why I founded the Khatib Initiative, to focus on change. So there are many things you can do. There is coming to places like this, finding friends in your neighborhood, or friends of your children in school who are Muslims, getting to know them on a personal level, getting involved with Daisy and me in our own initiative and work. We welcome your participation. We are a multi-faith. That's why this multi-faith desire, and this is the American way. Americans, when they see a problem, they want to fix it. And that's what's so great about the American spirit, the American way. And this is why we're hopeful that with the partnership of people like you and us, and giving us the opportunity to be with you, the opportunity of St. Joseph's College to accept the Khatibs in their donation, to invite people like me to speak before you, to take your questions and take your anger. And part of the biggest function that we had after 9/11 was just to be, to listen to people's anger and rage. And some of my students whom I couldn't go to all lectures, sent them, and they said if they were angry, they expressed it, but just explaining and speaking to people, they would thank them after yelling at you during the course of the discussions. At the end of it, they'll say, thank you, we had a wonderful time. Because part of it is hearing people's anger and saying, yes, you have grounds to be fearful, but these are the reasons for it, and this is how we can move forward and how we can put it behind us. And that's the work we're doing. I'm so confident that we can do it. The solutions are there, the understanding is there, and with this Obama administration, the will is there to improve the relationship with the Muslim world on a political level. And I'm extremely hopeful, and the expectations in Muslim world. I just came back from Jakarta and Malaysia last week. The expectations and the hope that people have in Indonesia and the Muslim world for this administration to turn over a new page and to work together with the Muslim world to address issues of common concern, because extremist interpretations of Islam are a threat not only to Western society but also to the Muslim societies themselves. Muslim societies and Muslim governments are the ones who are bearing the biggest brunt, the biggest victims of suicide bombing are the Pakistanis and the Iraqis today, not so much Israel or other countries. So there is common cause across both the political spectrum and the societal and mass people spectrum. So with this kind of networking and joining hands, I'm extremely confident and hopeful that within 5-10 years, half a generation, we will see a major shift in attitudes between our faith traditions.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. You're the boss.
has said it all, but I think when I spoke earlier, I said that Reza and Georgie were setting us on the path to truth, and you have served as a wonderful guide. You've provided light for the journey, and we will really treasure the thoughts, the insights, and really the vision that you have shared with us tonight. We appreciate your wisdom and your love, and we wish you so much success, and also Daisy in the work that you're doing. So God bless you both, and thank you all for coming tonight, and safe home.